Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. For our next session, a man who needs no introduction will get an introduction. Dr. Nick Mueller, the founding president and CEO emeritus now here at the National World War II Museum, came up with the great idea of this small little D-Day museum that became a bigger idea of a National World War II museum that is why we're all here today. Nick, after an illustrious academic career and administrative career, has dedicated the past 30 years of his life to this place, and he didn't do it alone. We want to thank you all, and we want to thank our supporters watching at home, and please have the questions coming after Nick finishes his conversation with Clint Smith. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nick Mueller.
Well, this seems a little bit like a family affair because Clint's mother and father, he's from New Orleans, and they are here. And my wife, who was his special ed teacher in the third grade, so he was around when all these ideas were in incubation period, I guess. And so we're pleased that your parents could be here with you today. And this is a special discussion with Clint. He's become a very renowned poet and author. His New York Times bestseller, The Word Has Passed. I'm sure some of you have read it. It's just an amazing work on sites of memory in America and the South. It won numerous awards, National Critics Circle Award for nonfiction, the Hillman Prize in Journalism, and the Stowe Prize in New York Times, and selected as one of the 10 best books in what year? 2021. Yeah. So those are accolades that any author would be happy with, and also best-selling poetry collection, Counting Dissent, has a bachelor's degree from Davidson, PhD in education from Harvard. And he's with us today to talk about his latest effort of research, which I'm going to come to in a moment, the Sites of Memory of World War II. And saw him at the Tulane Book Fest last year, and I said, "What are you working on?" And he said, "Sites of Memory of World War II." I said, "Wow, how did you get it from the Deep South to World War II sites of memory?" And I'm going to discuss that in a moment. But why do we bring authors, historians? Of course, we always have, and battles and strategies and leaders. But the authors, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, literary types, add value and meaning to everything that we do here. And I'll answer that question a little bit by saying 22 years ago, when we were in the conceptual design plans for the National World War II Museum, it took us 18 months. We thought we had it all figured out, the road to war, all the battles in Europe and the Pacific, and we got to the end and we were exhausted, and the exhibit designer said, "Well, you're not done." And he said, "What difference does it make that you are building a museum, a national museum for this country on World War II? What difference does it make? Why do you do it? What difference does the war make? What's it going to mean to people 50 years or 100 years from now? What's the legacy of World War II, and how are you going to tell that story?" We said, "Oh man, we thought we were done." that was a challenge for us. But that leads us into the whole issue about the Liberation Pavilion, which we just opened, and the very last pavilion, and probably the most difficult one. The museum story is, why the war was fought, the mission, and how it was won, and what it means today. So future generations will be and understand the price of freedom and be inspired by what they learned. So that meaning, Clint, is what drives some of our work here, some of our programming and exhibits. And of course, as a national museum, we too are a site of historical memory. And you have looked at sites that in multiple countries now, and that's what we talk about. And you know, when you get into the memory of the war and these sites and what transpired during the war, the atrocities, the Holocaust, all the things that we know, there are issues in our own country, Japan that you've studied, Korea, we'll talk about those, but memories are dangerous. Societies make big decisions about what they want to remember or commemorate in museums or in statues like Iwo Jima. I mean, that conveys something very different than some of the sites that he's going to talk about. But as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. So that's about where we come to. So let's just go into how did you choose this as an area of research and head off to Europe and Germany to look at some of these sites, and why did you do it, and what are you finding out from your research?
Yeah. Well, thank you all again for having me. Thank you for the invitation. As was mentioned, this is a sort of full circle, kind of surreal moment for me because I was in Mrs. Mueller's third grade class. I've told this story before, but in third grade, in Mrs. Mueller's class, we had a poetry assignment in which we had to write a poem about a color. And I chose the color gray. I don't know why, I was a strange child. And I wrote this poem about the color gray, and it went something like, I hate the color gray. It reminds me of a rainy day. Gray, I really hate that color. It's annoying, like my little brother. And so in class, Ms. Mueller is going to each student and she's kind of looking at their poems, and she comes to me and she puts her hand on my shoulder and she looks over and she reads the poem. And I turn around and she looks at me and she says, Clint, that was beautiful. You can be a writer one day. She might have told that to every kid in the room that day. I have no idea. But I always tell people that I remembered that moment for the rest of my life. And it really goes to, I think it's so important. I mean, so many of you in this room, I mean, your interest in this subject matter, your interest in scholarship and learning was catalyzed by oftentimes one teacher or two teachers or a handful of teachers. And I went on to become a high school teacher after I graduated. I taught high school English before I became a writer full-time. And I always remembered that as a way of reminding myself that the things that you tell young people matter, and they have a very long and profound impact on how they make sense of who they are. So I say all that, and now I'm sitting next to the esteemed Dr. Mueller. So it is a very cool moment for me all these years later. So for some context for folks who might not have been familiar with how the word is passed, in 2017, I watched several Confederate statues come down here in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And thinking about, well, what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned hundreds of enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy is what we know shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that doesn't mean that if you just take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, you erase the racial wealth gap, or if you change the name of Jefferson Davis Elementary School, you suddenly create more racially and economically egalitarian educational institutions. But it does, I think, help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help ground our collective understanding of American history and ground our understanding of the ways that certain communities have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout that history. And so I was thinking about that in the context of New Orleans, and the project began to expand, and I began to think about what sites of memory as it relates to slavery look like not only in New Orleans, but in Louisiana, what it looks like not only in Louisiana, but throughout the South, not only throughout the South, but across the country, not only across the country, but also across the ocean. And so the project sort of expanded and evolved, and I traveled to dozens of historical sites of memory, museums, memorials, monuments, prisons, plantations, neighborhoods across the country and the world, and ultimately wrote about 7 of them, which ended up in the book. And for me, it was a way of examining what places are effectively remembering the history of slavery, what places are running away from their responsibility to acknowledge their relationship to the history of slavery, and which are doing something in between. And so fast forward in 2021, the book comes out, and I'm on a book tour, and I'm struck by how during that book tour, there's so many people who are invoking Germany. And so people are saying, because part of what the book is examining is the ways that America has failed in so many ways to account for its relationship to the history of slavery. So many ways that it does not actively confront or engage honestly as it relates to that history. And people would constantly bring up Germany. They say, oh, Germany does this, and Germany does that, or Germany has this monument, Germany has that memorial, we should be more like Germany. And I began to sort of parrot this. I began, Germany does this, and Germany does that. And I got to the point where I was like, I keep talking about Germany. I've never been to Germany. I had been, but I had never been to Germany to examine these places or see these places. And so as a writer, as a scholar, I thought, I have to go over there. And so a few months after the book came out, I went to Germany because I wanted to get a sense of how Germany reckoned with its relationship to the history of the Holocaust. And was there something about what was happening in Germany that might be able to teach us something in the US about how we reckon or fail to reckon with our relationship to slavery? And so I went to Germany. I ended up writing a story for it for the Atlantic magazine, where I'm a staff writer. And as those of you who've been to Germany know, it is at once incredibly impressive, the way that Germany has directly confronted its relationship to the Holocaust and directly accounted for what happened. But it's also a more complicated story than the one that so often gets told from this side of the Atlantic. And so when I was in Germany, part of what happened is that I became more acutely aware of all that I did not know about World War II memory. I came to understand more fully that my sense of World War II was a very myopic, narrow story that largely was shaped by watching Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg movies, which I love, but also are telling a story that exists in a very specific American context. And I learned that when you go to other countries, as so many of the other panelists have spoken about, they have very different ways of telling the story about the war. And it was so eye-opening for me to encounter that in Germany. And I got really curious about what that looked like in other countries, but also what it looked like within the United States. What are the sort of stories about World War II that I had not encountered as a kid growing up that had something to say about what the war was and how it affected different people? And so I wanted to examine that within the context of the US, but also beyond it. And so after Germany, I decided, I need to come back home and figure out, well, what are the stories here in the US that I have not spent a lot of time engaging with? And so I visited the Navajo reservation in New Mexico and spent time with some of the surviving Navajo code talkers. I went to Japanese incarceration camps in California, specifically Manzanar, and spent time with the survivors of those camps, and then realized that the story of those camps was telling me I needed to go across the Pacific. And so then I went to Korea to examine the sort of landscape of memory as it pertains to the so-called comfort women, and then went from Korea to Japan to examine the history of atomic bomb survivors in Nagasaki, and then from Japan to Argentina, because when I was in Japan, I got a interesting sense of how the story of how Japan understands itself largely as victim, even though many of its neighbors understand it as perpetrator. And so there's a complicated story there. And so then I was interested in how the story of perpetrators are told. And so I went to Argentina and spent time in Bariloche, where many of the Nazis fled Germany after the war. And so I've kind of been doing this sort of cross-continental examination of World War II memory, and it's been so fascinating to see the ways that all of these different places are in conversation with one another.
Well, that's a good jumping off point let's just start maybe with Germany and Berlin and a couple of sites there that you visited and how they impacted you, what the visitors said, what messages are being communicated there. And I think that would be interesting. You've got some museums and you've also got these stumbling stones, the Stolperstein, which are also very, very interesting to me. So maybe you pick a couple to talk about in particular, and what do they convey?
Yeah, you just mentioned the Stolperstein. I mean, for me, that was one of the most striking things that I encountered. I'm sure so many of you all are familiar, but if for any reason folks here in the room or watching are not, the Stolperstein are these sort of 10 by 10 centimeter brass stones that are placed into the ground in front of the last place of residence of people who were killed or persecuted by the Nazis. And so there are over, I believe, 70,000 stones in 30 different countries across Europe. And so it's this really striking thing where, I'm kind of walking through the streets of Berlin, and you walk in front of a home, and there are two stumbling stones. And on the stones, it has the name of the person, their birth date, their death date, and the place where they were taken. So it might, have the name, birth and death date, and then say Auschwitz at the bottom. And then, so you walk, and in front of one home, along the cobblestone sidewalk, you see two Stolperstein laid down. And then you walk a little further, and you see 4. And you walk a little further, and you see 7. And you walk a little further, and you see 12 in front of some homes or some apartment complexes. And it's so striking because the nature of the Stolperstein forces you to pause, to stop, to look down, like the physical embodiment, or the physical act of stopping, to look down, to read. It almost creates this physical sort of sense of reverence. At least that's how I experienced it. And because it has the birth dates and the death dates, it's really fascinating because you can tell how old people were when they were killed. And so you have these moments where you look down and you can tell who the parents were, who the children were, who the grandparents were, who maybe was a cousin who was coming to study at the university. And you can almost kind of look down at these stumbling stones and then look up at the home or look up at the apartment building and begin to sort of imagine the lives of these people. What it does is, I think, gives you this profound sense of proximity to this history. And so for me, one of the central conceits of my project is that establishing a sense of physical proximity can more effectively establish a sense of temporal proximity, that we're reminded that these folks, that this history was not a long time ago. I mean, I think about that in the context of slavery in my previous work, and I think about that even more so in the context of this, given that we do still have people who lived through this war and have memories of this war who are still with us. And so, when I first went to Berlin, I was so struck by this because I kept thinking about, well, what would it look like if we did something like this here? Given that I had spent several years examining the ways in which this country so often fails to honestly account for and memorialize its relationship to the history of slavery. A history that, again, to remind folks, slavery existed in this country for 250 years and only has not existed for a little over 150. So it's an institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't in the American context. There are people who are alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people born into chattel slavery, right? My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. in 2016 herself was the daughter of an enslaved person. And so I'm always really interested in the ways in which our sort of public consciousness or the stories that we're told about slavery make it seem as if it's something that existed a long time ago and has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality. But part of what you understand when you start to examine that history is that history was just yesterday in the grand scheme of things. And so given that, and given our failure to memorialize that, I think the lessons that we can learn from something like the Stolperstein, like what would it look like if here in New Orleans, a place that was the domestic hub of the slave trade for so many years, what would it look like if we had our own version of the Stolperstein here? How profoundly would that change how we collectively as a country, as a city, as a state, remember what slavery was and remember the impact that it had on this city, this state, this country. And I just think that there's something to be learned from the way that in Germany you are constantly encountering iconography. You are constantly encountering, whether it be the small Stolperstein or something massive like the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. And those are two interesting things to sort of juxtapose alongside one another, because you have something that is so small, so intimate, that gives you proximity to the lives and homes of the people who were killed. And then you have something like the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is this massive, massive memorial in the middle of Berlin that is so central in that city in a way that is probably not commensurate to anything we have in the US. And they are both doing different sorts of things. I think the purpose of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe is to overwhelm. For those who don't know, it's these massive stone columns, thousands of them, in the middle of downtown Berlin. And as you move through them, the land itself, the ground sort of undulates and moves up and down, and it creates this overwhelming sense of being fully surrounded, fully darkened, fully caught up in the shadows of this history. And so I think those two sites themselves reflect all sorts of different mechanisms and ways that you can build iconography and construct public memory from different vantage points, from different places. But there's also, one of the most impactful things I saw was also the memorials at the train stations, where you walk through the train stations and on the platforms they have the amount of Jewish people sent to the camps in the East each day. And so it'll have a date, and then it will have the amount of people who were sent on that date. And again, it's the physical act of having your body in the place where history happened. The physical act of walking along these train platforms, and you see, it goes from 37 to 62 to 105 to 207 to 809 to 1,500. You see the crescendo of death and despair in a way that I think is so specific to what memorials can do, right? I think that museums and memorials and books, and they all play different roles and deeply important roles, but there is something so specific about having your body in the place where history happened and having something that can give you just even the smallest sense of the scale and the scope and the horror of what transpired.
Well, and Germany didn't end up in this place overnight. I mean, after the war, as many people here know, Germany felt like, most Germans felt like, well, it was really the SS and it was Hitler, and it wasn't all of us. That only began to change as documentaries of the Holocaust produced in this country started being shown in Germany. And then in 1992, I think in Hamburg, when it was pretty clear with an exhibit there that the Wehrmacht was complicit as well in the atrocities in Eastern Europe. And then when you talk about the Wehrmacht, then all of a sudden all families in Germany, almost everybody had someone in the Wehrmacht. And so then it began this national sort of transformation. And by the way, Alex Ritchie is probably here somewhere, but she leads one of our most compelling tours to Germany and to Poland, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, but goes to the places that he's talking about in Berlin, and I went to it too. And these are official museums that are funded for the most part by the Federal Republic of Germany. And the Stolperstein, there's now, I think, almost several hundred of them, several hundred thousand, and officially sanctioned for the villages and towns that want to put them. And they have people pay, I think, 120 euros or something for them. So there's this act of making some kind of a commitment to accepting their responsibility, and it's become a national, very, very different from after the war. And it's the young people of Germany that really began this in the 60s, and they were motivated to some extent by the civil rights movement in our own country, and wondering what their parents had done, these tremendous atrocities, and how did this war get started, and what was the ideology behind it. So there's an awful lot embedded in this national transformation in Germany that is very important. What did you talk to some of the visitors to these sites and come away with any impressions or communications
In Germany specifically?
In Germany, yeah. Let's just, while we're talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, part of what you come to understand is as impressive as these places were to me. I think, you know, for me, again, I was coming from a context in which I had spent several years examining a lot of the failures of U.S. public imagination and public memory as it relates to how we engage with building iconography to the history of slavery. And so for me to go and see these tens of thousands of Stolperstein, and to see the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, and to see the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and to see the Topography of Terror Museum, and just to be surrounded by constant emblems and sites of memory was so striking to me. But I do think it's important to name that people in Germany and Jewish people within Germany and Jewish people in Europe have very different conceptions of the efficacy or the ethics of these memorials. You know, it's a heterogeneous group of people, like any group of people. And so there are Jewish Germans who don't like the Stolperstein. You know, specifically I believe in Munich, they don't allow the Stolperstein to be placed because there is an idea that the stepping on the names and the sort of spirits and souls of Jewish people who were killed is incredibly disrespectful. That having it in a place where it can get dirty, where the dogs can, you know, defecate on it, where it can kind of get lost under snow, so there is this sense from some that a much more ethical way to commemorate this would be through plaques, through things that are sort of on stands that people have to encounter without looking down, that people encounter without stepping on them, that they see at face level. And I think that there are values to each of them, for sure. But it is, I think, a reminder, because I think what can happen, and this certainly happened at the beginning before I began studying any of this, is that you can kind of flatten the conversation, and you can make it a sort of like the U.S. does memory poorly and Germany does memory well. And the story is of course more complicated than that, because so much of this is geographical, so much of this, you know, how we commemorate, you know, the history of slavery in New Orleans, placing that in conversation with how Munich does versus Berlin versus how, you know, Frankfurt, or, you know, all of the different cities, in the same way that many cities in the U.S. have different ways of reckoning with their past, different cities in Germany have different ways of reckoning with their past, which is inevitably tied to the sort of Cold War, which is tied to whether you're in West Germany or former East Germany. And so there are all sorts of different factors that shape how people understand it. But one thing that was really interesting to me, I was at a Stolperstein with a Jewish woman, and she was talking about how, for her, every time she entered her building, she would encounter these Stolperstein, and she had, at the time, a 12-year-old daughter. And she was incredibly appreciative of the Stolperstein for, as she said, sort of pushing her to have a set of conversations with her daughter about what it meant to be Jewish in Germany in ways that she might not have done otherwise. And what was interesting too, I think, based on that, and then we had a conversation about this, was the similarities between how a Jewish person in Germany attempting to have a conversation with their child about what the Holocaust was, in so many ways mirrored the conversation that Black parents in the US tried to have in terms of what are the sort of ethical and developmentally appropriate ways to talk about the history of slavery or Jim Crow with your children. And you know, I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, and so I'm always thinking about what it means to talk about our family's history, our country's history, honestly. but also to do it in ways that feel age appropriate. And I think, so much of what she invoked was, do I bring her to Auschwitz? Do I bring her to a concentration camp? How honest am I with her about, what happened? In what ways do I sort of tone it down? And so I think part of what it revealed to me is that this is the parents and educators attempting to figure out how to communicate the history of atrocities that have happened in any given country, and how to sort of do it in a way that's scaffolded and developmentally appropriate for young people is a struggle that exists in, it's certainly not unique to us, and it is something that exists in all sorts of different places in all sorts of different ways.
That's right, and I think maybe we can shift over to some of the other sites in our country and in Asia in a moment, but one of the things that I've read in one of your other articles has nothing to do with World War II. You talk about a chosen amnesia that people have some of these sites, because you have families of the victims, of those who were sent to Auschwitz or Treblinka or anywhere, and now years past they might be alongside descendants of SS people. So how people work that out so they can, is there forgiveness there? Is there some redemption that comes out of visiting these places by families of the perpetrators or SS or and other visitors? Did you get to have any experiences with both sides, the victims and the perpetrators at any of these sites?
It's a great question. And part of what I didn't fully understand and what I learned once I went to Germany is how few Jewish people are still left in Germany at all. And so there is, the article you're alluding to, I wrote about Rwanda. So I wrote a story a few months ago about the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And I went to Rwanda last spring, and it was striking because, the genocide there only happened, as I said, 30 years ago. And so people who were perpetrators and people who were victims, millions of them are still alive today, living alongside one another. And part of what's so endlessly fascinating about that country is that in order for the country to move forward, they had to figure out how to have people who, someone who killed, like a person living next door to and having their children attend school with someone who killed several members of their family. And so for me, I was like, how does that happen? Like, how does somebody attend church with or work with or go to school with or live next to someone who killed multiple members of their family? And it is, as one scholar says, this sort of idea of chosen amnesia. There is this, I don't want to call it a false forgiveness, but there is a sort of a recognition that forgiveness sometimes is less for the perpetrator and is more for the survivor, or is more for the victim. That there has to be a sense of forgiveness that allows them to almost forget, to have this sort of amnesia, so to speak, so that they can move forward with their lives. Otherwise, I kept hearing the rage and the hate would overwhelm people. It would destroy people. And so in the context of Germany, it's a little bit different because because of how long ago the war was, because of the fact that 2/3 of Jewish people in Europe were killed, there are fewer Jewish people in the country of Germany than there are in the city of Boston. Mm-hmm. And many of those people who were Jewish in Germany their families were not in Germany in 1940, right? These are folks who were coming oftentimes from the Soviet Union. And so the texture of Judaism in contemporary Germany is not so much that someone is encountering, you're not regularly encountering a person whose ancestors were killed because so many obviously fled and so many themselves were killed. And so what does happen, what people tell me, is that they say that Jewishness in Germany is almost more of a sort of political abstraction than it is an actual group of people. That Jewishness is a sort of canvas upon which Germans can paint their contrition, rather than people that they confront or have to engage with every day. And so this one of the things that makes it different from a place like the U.S., where there's, tens of millions of people who are the descendants of enslaved people, or a place like Korea, we'll talk about Korea and Japan, where, there are tens of millions of people whose families were forced into slavery or work camps by the Japanese. In Germany, Germans are not encountering survivors or even the family of people who lived through it in the same way.
Well, and so let's segue over to, all of your sites are sites of victims where atrocities happened. Certainly, Japanese American incarceration camps are not the level, there's no equivalency there, but still it's victims. Same with the comfort women in South Korea. Nagasaki, it's a little bit mixed, as you said, but then we'll get to Argentina, and where there's sort of a shrine in an area that's a shrine of the Nazis go and commemorate. So there you have the perpetrators. So what was what did you learn from the visit to the areas of the incarceration camps you mentioned in California and the Navajo code talkers from the point of view of how people react to those sites today?
Yeah, it was interesting. I went to, after I came back from Germany, the first two places I went were the Navajo Reservation and then Manzanar incarceration camp. And I went to those places because I realized that these were two parts of the World War II story that I was barely taught anything about growing up. And so for me as a writer, I don't begin my nonfiction projects as an expert in this history. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, have spent many, many more years thinking about these things than I have. And so, but for me, what draws me into these projects is attempting to fill in the gaps of my own understanding, to recognize that I have sort of scholarly or intellectual voids that need to be, and craters that need to be filled. And so for me, I came back and I was like, well, I have a very surface level understanding of Navajo code talkers. I have a very surface level understanding of Japanese American incarceration camps. And so, in the context of the camps in California, I mean, one of the things that I learned that I hadn't understood was the extent to which the incentive to remove people, Japanese and Japanese Americans, from their homes in California and from the West Coast. I didn't understand the economic incentive that sort of undergirded it. I had always understood it as a sort of panicked, xenophobic project that was later regretted, and obviously, Reagan later issued his apology for it, and there was a sort of semblance of Japanese reparations to the families who experienced that, or their descendants. But I had not understood the extent to which there were lobbying efforts from sort of nativist organizations on the West Coast who were frustrated, disillusioned, infuriated by the fact that Japanese fishermen and Japanese farmers on the West Coast had what they believed were disproportionate ownership and claim to the land. And so there were many nativist white farmers and fishermen and organizations who supported them, who had long before Pearl Harbor been lobbying the United States and been lobbying both the state governments and the federal government to do something to get to ensure that white fishermen and white farmers had more access to and ownership of this farmland and these sort of fisherman spaces. And that Pearl Harbor ended up being an opportunity for them, for a group of people who had been kind of knocking at the door for a long time, lobbying their legislators to move on this, that Pearl Harbor they saw as a sort of perfect opportunity to use what happened and the sort of fear and xenophobia that emanated from that as a way to further push their agenda. And it ended up being incredibly effective, and many of the Japanese people had to either give away or sell at far, far, far reduced rates than their actual worth, their land, their fishing boats, their homes. And so that was fascinating because I had never understood it as a sort of economically incentivized project that had long been in the works for decades prior to Pearl Harbor happening.
And these were American citizens, Japanese American citizens, and Governor Wilson sent me to the Japanese American Museum there. And the first time I went there, Irene Hirano was the director of it, and the incarceration camps. That exhibit was the dominant exhibit that I saw at that time, and Danny Inouye, a senator, friend of this museum, he's never forgotten the fact that the U.S. government declared him to be an alien. And why didn't German Americans, who also owned property and land, they weren't rounded up?
Yeah.
And
this idea that, and the sort of cognitive dissonance of being rounded up, of being kept in horse stalls with your family, where the feces of horses still was, where you're laying on hay with your family as you wait to be transported to these various camps. And then being sent to these camps where you're living in really often horrific conditions in the middle of the desert, where it's 10 degrees at night and it's 90 degrees during the day, and you have very limited rations. And part of what brought me there was because the story I had been told about Japanese internment camps, Japanese incarceration camps, even thinking about what sort of language you use on that front, was that, they played baseball and they had dances, and it wasn't great, it wasn't ideal, we made a mistake, but it wasn't that big a deal. And I remember in my textbooks having pictures of sort of smiling Japanese American kids playing baseball, and that was the way that I was taught to think about what internment camps were. And so to go to these places and to go with people who themselves were in the camp and who are the descendants of those who were held in these camps, and to hear these stories of struggle, of illness, of the extent to which chronic illness then became a part of the lives of so many of the people who were held in these camps because of the horrific conditions they were a part of, to learn about what it meant for them to live in what was an open-air prison camp, right? Like that the guards were stationed, that nobody was allowed to leave. And then, as I was mentioning, the cognitive dissonance of being held in this camp, and then having the young men who were held in this camp then asked to go serve on behalf of this country while their families were still in the camps.
That's right.
And so, what does it mean? And to learn about the discussions that were had within the camp among the communities. All right, well, do we go serve because this is a way to prove our Americanness? This is a way to prove our commitment, and this will actually be better. And then people who were so disillusioned, they were like, why would I go serve in Europe for the very country that is incarcerating my entire family? And so to learn about the sort of discussions that were happening within the community, the disagreements that were happening in the community, the sort of cognitive dissonance that so many of the soldiers who were on the front in Europe felt even as they were there, the sort of irony, the kind of tragic and irony of the fact that among the first people to liberate Dachau was a group of Japanese American soldiers, while their parents and families were in these camps. I mean, so again, I have these moments in the book where I had visited Dachau, and then I go to the internment camps and learn the stories about the group of Japanese American soldiers who were among the first to liberate Dachau, and then thinking about the way that they were treated and their families continue to be treated even while that was happening. You begin to see the sort of connective tissue of the whole war in that way.
And what are visitors taking away from that today, as just general visitors who know little about the story, as well as the descendants who go back now? Is it a relief for them? Is there any resolution that they get from that experience and sharing what their parents or grandparents went through?
I think that there is a real, what's interesting is you kind of alluded to the silence that existed in Germany after the war. That there was this period, this sort of decades-long silence in which people who participated or were there in Germany at all kind of didn't want to talk about it, right? And it wasn't until the next generation and the next generation of their kids and grandkids came into the fold and started asking questions like, oh, what happened during the war? Where were you during the war? Like, who they're finding their father's uniforms, up in the basement after they passed away. And so these questions start to be asked that allows for a period of silence to come to an end. And one of the, we were talking about connective tissue, one of the things that was so common among all the places that I visited, and in this context, in terms of Japanese Americans, was that there was also a long period of silence after the people were let out of the camps. So between 45 and maybe 75, there was like a long extended period in which the children and grandchildren of those who were held in the camps, many of them didn't know that their parents were held in these camps because the parents didn't talk about it. I have one woman I speak to who says every time she began to hear even murmurs of it, she would walk into a room and all the adults would go silent. And so there was this desire to not talk about it for some, because they didn't want to bring it back up, because they were suffering from PTSD. It was this, as we said, this sort of chosen amnesia, this attempt to forget so they could move forward with their lives, but also an attempt to try to protect their children from anything that would make them feel less American, right? Because I think for so many Japanese Americans after the war, there was like, okay, this has happened, but now we are going to show people how American we are. So this will never happen again, which is something that you see across many sort of historically marginalized communities in the US and abroad, is a desire to prove one's Americanness. And you all have this, the amazing exhibit, obviously, of Black soldiers, and W.E.B. Du Bois has the sort of the off-cited quote where he talks about, I think for him it's in the context of World War I, but is applicable to World War II. But the sort of, but the double V campaign, right? Victory at home, victory abroad, as a way that Black soldiers fighting in the war, both in World War I and World War II, can sort of prove that Black people are worthy and deserving of the rights and citizenship in this country.
And that was similar to the Japanese Americans who volunteered. Some 20,000 of them left the camps to go fight in one of the most decorated units, Medal of Honors units, including Senator Inouye among them. So I think we're running out of time a little bit. I do want to get to your comments about the site of memory in Argentina, Bariloche, just to quickly, and then Jeremy, then we'll open it up for questions. Is that okay? I mean, I think we're kind of, it's been fascinating, so we're not getting over all of it, but it's okay. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, so the last place I went is Argentina. I went to Bariloche, and I went because I had heard so much about the rat lines of former SS and Gestapo leaders who found a way, often through the help of the Vatican, which was its own sort of fascinating revelation for me, would find ways to escape from Germany and make their way to Argentina. There was a large population of Germans in Argentina long before World War II. They had come in multiple waves. A bunch of Germans had come in the mid-19th century and went to Chile, and then emigrated from Chile to Patagonia in the sort of region where Bariloche is in southern Argentina. And one of the things that I'm doing there is examining this sort of conspiracy theory that I'm sure so many of you all are familiar with, that that Hitler did not in fact die in his bunker in Berlin, but instead he escaped to Argentina and lived for many, many years in a house in Bariloche. And so one of the things that I did was I got on a boat and went with my guide to this home known as Inalco House, where it is said that Hitler had escaped to. And I was struck by how prevalent that sentiment was among the people there. So this Inalco is a sort of remote place off of in Patagonia, and it is very difficult to access unless you are taking a hydroplane or boat. And so many of the people I spoke to, I would say, kind of, in some ways kind of tongue-in-cheek, do you believe that Hitler, really lived in this house? And so many people said that was something that they believed. And even if they didn't believe or were unsure that Hitler lived there, they believed that there were other Nazis who lived there. And part of what's true is that there were many Nazis who fled, probably most famously Erich Priebke, who in 1994 was found by ABC News and Sam Donaldson in a sort of news report that was broadcast around the world, and he had participated in, he was a member of the Gestapo in Italy, had participated in a massacre that killed 350 people, was later revealed and arrested in Bariloche, extradited to Italy, and ultimately served a life sentence under house arrest, and lived until he was 100. And so the interesting thing about Germany is that it exists on this, there's the sort of conspiratorial element, you know, that largely revolves around whether or not people believe that Hitler had actually made his way to Germany. And then there's the recognition that there are many Nazis who did flee, that Mengele, that Eichmann, that Pribke, among others, were all folks who had fled to Argentina, which fuels this sense of Germany, of Hitler's ostensible escape being a very real possibility in the minds of many people. And I spoke to one guy there, I spoke to many German Argentinians, and people whose families had emigrated from Germany, and I said, do you think that, you know, Hitler escaped Berlin and came to Bariloche? And he's like, I don't know, I can't say whether he did or he didn't, but he said, if you want to hide an elephant, what do you do? And I was like, I don't know where this is going. And he said, you put them in a room full of elephants. And what he meant by that was that Bariloche was suffused with escaped SS, escaped Gestapo, former Nazis. And so that, again, it sort of fuels this feeling of many there who are like, you know, there were a lot here. Who am I to say whether or not there might have been one more?
Do they have any commemoration events, birthday celebrations around Hitler's birthday or anything like that that would represent a way to keep that mythology alive?
They do. For many, the Analco House has for a long time been a sort of site of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. There are people who've gone to Bariloche and other parts of Argentina with the specific intention, specifically around Hitler's birthday. There are a lot of rumors that there are, for a long time, they weren't rumors, it was very clear there were parties and celebrations in the years after the war. It is said that those parties and celebrations still exist, except they are sort of, they're not publicized in the same way that they were before, but a lot of folks who you speak to in Bariloche will acknowledge that there is this feeling that their home is inextricably linked to this sort of neo-Nazi fantasy that Hitler did not, in fact, again, sort of succumb to or give up in his bunker and take his own life, but instead thwarted the West and thwarted the Allies and tricked them and somehow escaped. And that for many years, he and others were planning how to revive the Third Reich, even though it never came to fruition.
Jeremy, we're running late. Do we have time for a few questions? Maybe we can weave in Asian examples here in the course of the questions.
A round of applause for Clint Smith and Nick Mueller, please. We're going to go to your right, gentlemen, about a third of the way back. Sorry.
Thank you. I feel like my worldview had changed a little today by you. Growing up in Hebrew school, we were shown films from the Holocaust starting at 7, which I think is way too young for what we were shown. And I've developed an adverse feeling about ever visiting Germany. And I mean, my parents had numbers on their arms. I have family who were the only 2 survivors, just married each other, and moved to Paris to have a business. It's in my life memory. And yet, when you started talking about it, and I've known Germany has a very strong relationship with Israel and a strong sense of responsibility, I realized that one of the precepts is that you can't blame the children for the faults of the father. And you've changed that. Now, in reference to some of the other things you said, wherever we went, we would try to do, where it's applicable, I mean, it didn't work in Antarctica, but we'd do a Jewish tour. And in Barcelona, that involved 1492. And where was I going with that? Yeah, in Eastern Europe, we found in Budapest, they have little shoes statued on the Danube because they would line people up with their backs facing the Danube and, you know, shoot them. And I realized that they are taking responsibility in some ways all over. They're not doing it, you're right, they're not really doing anything here. And nothing that's as overt. A lot of people don't want to remember or don't want to admit that they were wrong about things. I'm wondering, are you putting this together in a book? Because I kept looking, is there a book? Did he write a book? And I didn't see anything. So, oh, good. Please answer that question. I really, really want to know.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Yes, my editor will be heartened to hear that. I have a book. I just finished putting together the first draft of the manuscript. It should be out in 2026, Just Beneath the Soil. I have my book, How the Word is Passed, which is about memory of slavery sites, and this one is a sort of taking the same conceit as I've discussed, but thinking about World War II memory. And so yes, all of the places I've talked about and that we didn't have the opportunity to talk about are in my next book, so stay tuned.
We'll go down the center aisle with Connie, see if we have time for one more after this.
So, wonderful presentation. I had visited Berlin 40 years ago. There were no memorials, nothing. And back 10 years, a tremendous amount. Do you know what cause, is there any cause for that change? And conversely, in America, it seems like we're going backwards now. We're trying to deny slavery in high school books. We're trying to downplay it, saying that slavery wasn't that bad, that slaves were given trades, by being slaves. So anyway, it's one way, it's going this way, and in America, it's going back.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. So I think that in Germany, there were, as Dr. Mueller alluded to, the film in the US, the Holocaust, I think it came out in the 70s, was a huge wake-up call for many people. I think that because there was so much silence in Germany, there were many, children of those who lived through World War II that did not have any sense of what happened because that was not a part of the public consciousness, that was not a part of public memory. And so it was incredibly revelatory, almost in the way that, people talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin here in the US. For so many people in the North, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was, in many ways, Lincoln, there's the story about Lincoln going to Harriet Beecher Stowe when she came to the White House and said, so you're the little lady who started this great war. Because she wrote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which illuminated for millions of people in the North the realities of slavery in ways that they had never encountered. And in many ways, this film in the 1970s did so for many Germans and people across Europe. But there were also real grassroots efforts from people who themselves were the descendants of those killed, and also Germans who were simply horrified by what they hadn't known. One of those people is a woman named Leah Roche, and she was at the forefront of pushing Germany to establish, she was a television journalist, but when she became cognizant of this history, she was pushing and forcing and advocating for Germany to be more honest about its relationship to this history and to build what ultimately became a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. And here in the US, I think that the story of the United States, the story of America, and one of the places I went, I think I will end on this. It looks like they're trying to pull us off the stage, but one of the places I went for my book was Monticello. And Monticello was really interesting and important to me because I think that Jefferson in many ways embodies the cognitive dissonance of the US, in the sense that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined. It has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. Both of those things are the story of America. There is so much to be proud of, and there is much to be ashamed of. And we have to hold both of those things alongside one another, and recognize the entanglement of the two is part of what shapes the American project, and it is okay. We should encourage ourselves to hold both of those things together. We don't have to pretend America is only and has only ever been bad things, or that America is only and has ever been good things. That, like every other country, part of what this book has done for me is saying that like every country has their version of this, right? There's a lot of good, and there's a lot that's not good. And you have to hold both of those alongside one another. And so I think any effort to push us to, that disincentivizes us or dissuades us from not holding both of those realities alongside one another, from not thinking of Jefferson, that Jefferson was one of the most brilliant, important intellectual founders of this country, and he is also someone who owned over 600 enslaved people. And you have to hold both of those things alongside one another. I think sometimes these can be, when you try to present the totality of the empirical reality of what has transpired in this country, whether you're talking about somebody like Jefferson, whether you're talking about the Confederacy, whether you're talking about whatever the case may be, sometimes that can be presented as an ideological project rather than an empirical one. But I think we cannot allow ourselves to be, that the suggestion that books that are attempting to present parts of the American story that have not been presented before, that might make us have to reassess our understanding of America as a complicated place with a complicated history, again, that has done things that we can be proud of and that has done things that we can't. Any effort to get rid of those books or to take down or to attempt to keep up certain monuments that glorify a past that is not worth glorifying. I mean, that's an entirely different presentation, but I do think it is incredibly important in this moment that we not allow ourselves to think about teaching history honestly as something that is a political or ideological effort, but is instead something that is just grounded in honesty.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Let me just thank Clint on a personal level, and this has been an invigorating and important conversation to have, and just want to say that out of holding things in both hands, our exhibit in Liberation Pavilion starts off with finding hope in a world destroyed. So we have to look for hope in all of these conversations too. And the last thing I'd say is I'm glad my wife got you off to a good start here. So anyway,